All right, let's do this. We're diving deep into Frankenstein today. Not just the story everyone knows, but we're going right to the source. We've got excerpts from the book itself, and we're going to break it all down.
I think what's really interesting is we're going to look at Frankenstein not just as a horror story, but as, you know, a work that reflects the time it was written in and Mary Shelley's own life as well.
Exactly. I mean, the plot's pretty famous, but going back to Shelley's actual words,
Yeah.
it's pretty amazing, especially when you think about all the ways Frankenstein has been, adapted and reinterpreted over the years.
Right. And looking at the original text, let's just see, like, what are those core themes as opposed to everything that's been added on later?
Okay, so let's jump right in with that iconic moment, the creature's birth. This is how Shelley describes it. With an anxiety that almost amounted to agony, I collected the instruments of life around me, that I might infuse a spark of being into the lifeless thing that lay at my feet. Talk about intense.
Yeah. And it really gets to the heart of who Victor Frankenstein is.
Mm.
His ambition, his obsession with unlocking the secrets of life. But there's always a price, right? That kind of unchecked ambition, that desire for knowledge without thinking about, well, the consequences. That's the foundation of this whole tragedy.
And the creature itself, Shelley doesn't sugarcoat it. His yellow skin scarcely covered the work of muscles and arteries beneath. His hair was of a lustrous black and flowing, his teeth of a pearly whiteness. But these luxuriances only formed a more horrid contrast with his watery eyes, that seemed almost of the same color as the dun-white sockets in which they were set, his shriveled complexion and straight black lips. Frankenstein was aiming for beauty, but what he got was, well, let's just say it's the stuff of nightmares.
But here's what I find really interesting. Kelly makes this connection between the creature and a newborn baby. Both of them are thrown into a world they don't understand, but both driven by these basic needs: connection, knowledge. It forces us to think about the creature not just as a monster, but as, someone struggling to find his place.
And that journey to find his place, man, it takes some crazy turns. He's driven by this desire for knowledge, for companionship, and ultimately, revenge. When Rick even said that, like, both the creature and Milton Satan, they're more interesting because they have these human qualities, that mix of monster and human, that's what keeps us hooked.
To really get this character, though,
Hmm.
we have to look at the woman who created him, Mary Shelley. Her own life, her parents, her husband, Percy Shelley. It's all woven into the story.
Okay, before we go too far, can we just talk about that inscription on Mary Shelley's gravestone for a second? It literally says, daughter of William and Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin and widow of the late Percy Shelley. It's like she wanted to make sure everyone knew exactly who shaped her, you know?
And they each did play a huge role. Her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, this like trailblazing feminist writer. Her father, William Godwin, a really well-known political philosopher.
Yeah.
They give her this deep understanding of like social dynamics and how powerful ideas can be.
And then there's Percy Shelley, the romantic poet, the rebel, the heartthrob. You can't really separate Mary Shelley's story from his.
No, their relationship was super intense. Passion, intellectual debates, tragedy. It's amazing how much Victor Frankenstein is like Percy Shelley.
Hmm.
That brilliance, the idealism, but also being self-absorbed and like putting his intellectual pursuits above relationships.
And that's what we see with Victor and Elizabeth, his fiance, right? She talks about being anxious, about letters he never answers. And there's this one commentator who points out, in Frankenstein, Elizabeth suffers separation anxiety from Victor, writes him letters that are never returned, hints of her jealousy of other women, and eventually dies because Victor's attentions are focused elsewhere. It's almost like a pattern, repeating itself.
Right. That mirroring between fiction and reality, it adds a whole other level to the story. But it does make you think, did Mary Shelley like set out to write this masterpiece, this cautionary tale that would, last for centuries?
Well, I found this part where she talks about how she started Frankenstein. It was commenced partly as a source of amusement and partly as an expedient for exercising any untried resources of mind. Amusement. That's kind of wild considering all the heavy stuff we're talking.
It is. It's amazing how this like simple thing she started doing turned into this story that's captivated readers for generations. And we can't forget the impact of like the 1931 movie with Boris Karloff. That was a huge hit and really solidified, Frankenstein in pop culture. It went way beyond just being a story.
So she was just looking for a creative outlet and ended up tapping into something universal, something that speaks to our deepest fears. What is it about Frankenstein that keeps people coming back after all this time?
It's the questions it raises, right? about scientific ambition, about what happens when we do things without thinking about the consequences, about the nature of good and evil, and that deep need for connection. These are themes that go beyond any specific time or culture. It makes Frankenstein more than a spooky story. It's about, like, the human condition.
Okay, so Robert Walton, he's the explorer, and his letters actually frame the whole story. He's on this crazy, dangerous expedition to the North Pole, totally driven by ambition, wanting glory and discovery. Shelley writes about this like cold northern breeze that's fueling his excitement, and how convinced he is that he's meant for something extraordinary.
And here's where it gets really interesting. When we look at Walton, we see these, like, striking similarities to Victor Frankenstein. They're both driven by ambition, both willing to risk it all, and maybe, just maybe, both kind of blind to how dangerous that can be.
And get this, Walton actually ends up befriending the creature, the one Frankenstein is trying to destroy. The creature even says something about wanting kindness, and Walton seems to genuinely feel for him. It's this ironic twist that shows us like another side of the creature.
Yeah, it really makes you think, if the creature just wanted connection to be understood, could everything have been different? Was he always a monster, or did the way the world treated him make him that way?
So we have this creature totally alone, trying to make sense of the world. He's watching people stealing books. He even reads Volney's Ruins of Empires. That's an intense crash course in humanity.
And that knowledge, that's where things get really tough for him. The more he learns, the more he realizes how different he is, how cruel the world can be. He comes to this heartbreaking realization of what a strange nature is knowledge. It clings to the mind when it is once seized on it, like a lichen on the rock. Miserable, unhappy wretch. You could just feel his despair in those words.
This is a creature who's intelligent, who's learning and growing, but he's also deeply wounded. And that desire for a companion, it becomes this desperate plea for someone to see him, to get him. But when Frankenstein refuses, well, that's when things go really, really bad.
That refusal, that's what sets off the creature's spiral into revenge. He attacks the people Frankenstein loves, leading to the deaths of William, Justine, and Clerval. And then there's that terrifying threat hanging over everything. I will be with you on your wedding night. It's like a promise of destruction, born out of pain and isolation.
And it just keeps escalating. The creature destroys Frankenstein's bride, but then you see this flicker of regret, this desire to stop his own suffering. That final scene on the ice raft, where the creature is planning his own funeral pyre. It's scary and heartbreaking at the same time.
It's a really complicated ending, right? Leaves us with more questions than answers.
Hmm.
But it makes us confront some hard truths about being human, our ability to create and destroy, and how our choices shape everything.
We left off with the creature like totally spiraling, seeking revenge, and Frankenstein just overwhelmed with guilt and fear. It's like this downward spiral, with no end in sight. But could things have gone differently? I mean, the creature had this like really unusual education, learning about the world just from watching people and reading those stolen books.
And it's that education that actually makes things worse for him. Imagine, suddenly being exposed to all these complexities of society, the inequalities, the good and bad parts of human nature, but without any guidance or context. It would be overwhelming.
He's literally eavesdropping on this woman, Safi, while she's learning French from one of the cottagers. Talk about unconventional learning. He even learns about social class, the huge gap between rich and poor. It's like he's reading like a sociology textbook for the first time and having a total breakdown.
He sees this immense wealth and squalid poverty of rank, descent, and noble blood, and realizes he has nothing like that. He asks himself, what was I? Of my creation and creator, I was absolutely ignorant, but I knew that I possessed no money, no friends, no kind of property. His isolation goes way beyond just being physically alone.
It makes his desire for a companion even more like heartbreaking. He's not just looking for someone who won't be scared of how he looks. He wants someone who gets what he's been through, who understands the weight of all that knowledge he's carrying.
He tries to connect with the cottagers, hoping they'll be kind, that they'll accept him, but their reaction is pure terror. They reject him, which just confirms all his fears about being different, about being an outsider. It's this awful cycle. His isolation makes him angry, and his anger makes him even more isolated.
And we're seeing all this through all these layers of storytelling, right? Frankenstein tells his story to Walton, who's writing it all down in letters to his sister. It's like a story within a story within a story. It makes you think about how the way we see things depends on who's telling the story.
That layered narrative is one of the things that makes Frankenstein so brilliant. Shelley uses it to explore different perspectives, and it forces us, as readers, to question if we're getting the whole truth. Whose version of events should we believe?
It's like we're right there on the ship with them in the Arctic, listening to Frankenstein confess and deal with all his regrets. But there's also this parallel between Frankenstein and one of the cottagers, Felix. They're both idealists, and they both make choices that have these terrible consequences.
Felix is completely devoted to his family, and he risks everything to help this guy who's been wrongly imprisoned. It's a noble thing to do, but it ends up destroying his family, forcing them into exile. It's like a mirror of what Frankenstein does, showing how good intentions can still go so wrong.
They were both trying to do the right thing, but they were driven by passion, not by thinking things through. It reminds us that even when we mean well, our choices can have consequences we don't expect. We have to think about how what we do affects other people, the ripple effect of our actions.
Frankenstein is definitely a cautionary tale, but it's also about how interconnected our lives are. The choices we make can shape not just our own lives, but the lives of everyone around us.
One of the most powerful parts for me is when the creature, totally consumed by despair, burns down the cottage after the family runs away. It's such a raw act of rage, but there's also this deep sadness to it. It's like he's destroying the last little bit of hope he had for being accepted.
It's a turning point for him. He's facing the reality of his isolation and realizing that maybe belonging is just not possible for him. He lashes out in a way that reflects all the pain and rejection he's experienced. It's like a primal scream.
Shelley describes it so vividly. A fierce wind arose from the woods and quickly dispersed the clouds that had loitered in the heavens. The blast tore along like a mighty avalanche and produced a kind of insanity in my spirits that burst all bounds of reason and reflection. Even nature seems to mirror what's going on inside him.
Shelley's use of nature throughout the book is amazing. The storms, the mountains, the icy landscapes, they all reflect the emotions of the characters. It's like the environment itself becomes another character in the story.
Yeah, and it sets the stage for this, epic chase scene, right? Frankenstein chasing his creation, driven by guilt and this need to set things right, and it all leads to this harsh, unforgiving landscape, the Arctic. It's like they're both descending into this, physical and emotional hell.
It's such a powerful symbol of their shared isolation and the consequences of their choices. And it's in this desolate setting that Frankenstein stumbles upon Walton's ship, stuck in the ice. He's weak, close to death, and he just pours his heart out to Walton, warning him about the dangers of ambition and begging him to finish what he started, to destroy the creature.
There's this really poignant line where Frankenstein says, "Learn from me. How dangerous is the acquirement of knowledge, and how much happier that man is who believes his native town to be the world than he who aspires to become greater than his nature will allow." It's like he's finally understanding the price he paid for wanting to know too much.
It's a confession, a warning, a plea for redemption. He sees himself in Walton, that younger version of himself, driven by ambition and wanting to leave his mark on the world. But he also sees how those ambitions can destroy you.
So Frankenstein dies. What happens to the creature? Does he just disappear into the Arctic wilderness, or is there more to his story?
Well, this is Frankenstein, so of course there's a twist. The creature doesn't just vanish. He shows up on board the ship, drawing to Frankenstein's body, and what he does next is really surprising and incredibly moving.
So the creature shows up on the ship, and what happens then? This whole story has been so unpredictable. I can only imagine what Shelley has in store for us now.
Well, you might think, he'd be furious, maybe even try to attack the crew as like a final act of revenge. But what we get is so much more complex, so much more human. The creature goes to Frankenstein's body, not to hurt anyone, but to mourn.
To mourn. He can feel grief. After all the destruction, all the anger, he's capable of sorrow.
Yeah. He expresses this deep sense of loss, this understanding that his creator, his tormentor, is gone. It's almost like he's really feeling the weight of being alone, and now that the only being who ever understood where he came from is gone.
What about Walton and the crew, though? They have to be terrified. This is the creature they've heard all the stories about, the monster Frankenstein warned them about. Do they attack, try to defend themselves?
They're paralyzed with fear, but the creature doesn't threaten them. Instead, he talks to Walton, almost trying to explain his actions, to make them understand the pain that led him to this point.
So what does he say? What's his final message after all this?
He says his mission is complete, that his revenge died with Frankenstein. There's this chilling line where he says, "I shall die. I shall no longer feel the agonies which now consume me, or be the prey of feelings unsatisfied yet unquenched." It's like he's finally accepting his fate.
It's almost more tragic knowing he's choosing this, right? He could keep going, keep causing destruction, but he decides to end it. Why?
He tells Walton he's going to build a funeral pyre and basically set himself on fire, disappear from a world that never accepted him. It's like one last act of rebellion, rejecting the fate that was forced upon him.
So both the creator and the creation, they both die. But the story doesn't end there, does it?
No, not at all. It keeps resonating with us because it forces us to ask some really tough questions about ourselves. Could Frankenstein have stopped this whole tragedy if he had treated his creation with compassion? Would society have reacted differently if they hadn't been so driven by fear and prejudice? These are the kinds of questions that stay with you long after you finish the book.
Frankenstein is a masterpiece, not because it's just a scary story, but because it explores these really complex parts of human nature, the desire for knowledge, the consequences of what we do, that deep need for connection, for acceptance.
And it reminds us about the power of storytelling itself. The way Shelley uses these layers of narrative, different perspectives, to pull us in and make us question everything we think we know.
It's a reminder that sometimes the monsters we fear are the ones we create, both literally and figuratively. And that maybe, just maybe, a little bit of kindness could change everything.
Well, I think we've gone about as deep as we can on this one. Thanks for joining us for this exploration of Frankenstein. Hopefully you've come away with some new insights, some things to think about, and maybe even a little bit of fear and wonder. Because that's what a good story does, right? It stays with you long after you're done reading it.